Welcome back to the Pursuit of Property podcast. Today, we are doing a follow-up episode to all the way back to episode 42, which, funny enough, focused on the importance of follow-up. And I'm sitting here with my co-host, Scott Farrow. Scott, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Just hanging out, ready to talk about something that we really feel is going to be important over the next 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had our episode 42 really just focusing on the importance of follow-up, not really getting into the nitty-gritty of how we do follow-up, why we do specific follow-ups for, one group of people or specific follow-ups for another group of people. So today's episode, we're really just going to focus on what we call is our blueprint for following up with leads in your system, right? We've all heard of the phrase, we've repeated it who knows how many times across all our podcast episodes, but the money is in the follow-up. A very slim amount of people that you talk to are going to be ready to sell at that exact moment, right? So if you're not taking those people whose timelines aren't, right now, and if you're not following up with them later on at a consistent schedule that we'll get into, you're really not going to be closing very many deals if you're not doing very much follow-up.
Yeah. I would attribute that every time that I had a lull in my business, it was because I was either not focusing on follow-up at all, or I was not following up correctly. And you and I take a lot of pride that our podcast is designed to give you more of a manual style and something that you can really actually implement and less just big picture all the time. So over the last few weeks, we've talked a lot about the market, and I think today we're going to follow kind of a step-by-step model on what you and I are currently doing that we're seeing success with, and then hopefully anybody listening is going to be able to implement this, and as the market shifts, the sellers that maybe were a no today might turn into a yes, and by following this accurately, you can then start to actually close more deals.
Absolutely, and I want to open with this too. This is I would call it a very rough blueprint because I would say there's really no 100% correct way to follow up, right? A lot of times it really deals specifically to the person, the situation, the conversations you've had before, right? And kind of getting that sixth sense on when it's a good time, to next follow up. So let's jump into it. Let's jump into our step one of, our blueprint of this follow-up. And really the important thing here is qualifying the leads and then also the designation of those leads.
Yeah.
Now, talking about that a little more is designation. Really, there's kind of three different designations for leads. You've got cold leads, warm leads, and hot leads. And, people may call them something else, but really it kind of just falls into those three categories.
Right.
Low probability, mid probability, or high probability, however you want to do it. Right. So when a lead comes in, it is your job, our job, the leads manager job to, one, review those notes, two, shoot them a call, and kind of see where these people might be at on that spectrum.
Yeah. Well, and you can't treat everybody the same. You said it well that there's no perfect formula for follow-up. So essentially, when you're looking at how you're going to follow up with somebody, you have to understand like their timeline, their motivation, their price, and their condition. We call them the 4 pillars. And by getting that information, you're able to set up a system on how you're going to talk to this person over the next weeks and months. And a person who's very highly motivated with a great price and needs to sell now is going to be totally different than the person who says, hey, I'm going through a divorce, or I'm going through an eviction or a probate, and in 6 months, I might be able to make a sale work, right? And so the key here is when we're putting all this into a CRM, which there's another episode on CRMs back in the 40s range.
Yeah.
You need to be able to identify who to prioritize and who is which lead. Because at some point, if you're doing this right, you're going to be following up with people for 6 to 12 months, and you might not remember that person when you see their name, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing we wanted to mention and note too is when you're deciding on these lead designations, right? if a lead comes in, really we tag it as that they need qualification, right? We've had a very initial, low key conversation with them, but really we kind of need that next step in-depth phone call before we make that designation. Now, when they're in that needing qualification stage, what we do is something called 10 days of pain. Yeah. I've heard it as, I've seen 7 days of hell, it's some kind of variation. We refer to it as 10 days of pain. And the reason for this is, this was something you were bringing up when we were kind of brainstorming this podcast, is speed to the lead, right? You need to be in front of that lead as quick and as often as possible. So in 10 days of pain, you are calling that lead 10 days in a row, if not once a day, twice a day, but for 10 days in a row until you are able to get a hold of that lead and then designate them to their correct, label.
And this is not like a persistent, every time we try to reach them, we try to call them 10 days in a row. This is, so say you have a mailing campaign. If you get a mail response and that person gets input into your CRM, that you don't necessarily need to do a 10 days of pain for. But say you have Facebook leads, or you have cold calling leads, or you have referral leads. The 10 days of pain is just a way of making your initial contact. And the whole point of it is, like you said, it's speed to lead. In this market, there's just going to be people who need to get business, right? So people are going to be more willing to be quick to call back or follow up. So you just need to be the first one there. And the way that you do that is, if they don't answer, you call them back later that day. And then the next day you call, you text, you call. The next day you call, you text, you call, until you get a hold of them. Once you get a hold of them, now we go to the designation stage, hot, warm, or cold.
Yep. And like we mentioned, and this kind of leads us into step 2, depending on where they fall into, that hot, warm, or cold, our follow-up system is going to be different, right? And that leads us into step 2, implementing each specific follow-up campaign, whether they are hot, warm, or cold leads. Yeah. And if we take a step back and we look at it, it's really common sense, right? If you've got somebody who you consider a hot lead, you're not going to follow up with them, once a month or once a quarter like you may do for a cold lead. I mean, you're going to lose out on the deal, right? If somebody's a hot lead, you've got to be in front of them, front of their mind, talking to them as often as possible until you can get that contract signed. So
real quick, can I tag in? We noted earlier, in passing, I mentioned the 4 pillars of motivate, or of a lead qualification. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to run through it one more time because we're going to reference it. But it's price, motivation, condition, and time frame. A hot lead would be somebody who has 3 or 4 of those pillars. So when you call, if in that qualification call they give you a price that they want for the home, that's within, a reasonable ballpark that you would actually be able to pay. If they give you a time frame of how soon they want to sell it, they give you a condition of the home, they're able to describe it to you, and they tell you why they want to sell, that's a hot lead. So this isn't an art form of trying to figure out what's a hot lead, what's a cold lead. There is some flow with it, but a hot lead has to have at least 3, if not 4.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's start with those hot leads. So you've got a group of hot leads in your system. You need to figure out how to follow up with them. We've talked about it a little bit, but your conversations with your hot leads should be, if not daily, at least every other day, right? And just kind of like a daily check-in, right? Being at the front of their mind, touching base, checking in, right? Because if somebody's a hot lead, a big part of the decision they go with is who they feel like, 1, has their best interest at heart, and 2, that name recognition is going to be big. If you're not following up with them as much as another investor might be, your chances of taking down that hot lead are going to be a lot lower.
Yeah, and it doesn't always have to be a phone call, but you have a touch out to them every day or every other day. Now, if your hot lead is 3 months away, there's going to be some wiggle room, and that's something to keep in mind. We're going to give you the blueprint for generically what you should be doing. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of an art form knowing situationally what you need to do. But if this person's looking to sell in the next 30 days, you should be making that touch every other day or every day to move that ball slightly forward. And then when the day comes, like you said, we're going to be the person that they think of first, or the person that they feel the most comfortable with, because we tend to get along with the people that we see most often.
Yeah, and I like the way you phrase that. Continually moving or inching the ball forward on every touch or every phone call. And let's talk about what, I mean, we're doing all these touches, texts, calls, right, on these hot leads. But let's talk about what we should actually be talking about, right? Because that's the other important aspect to, kind of this follow-up blueprint for these categories is, one, how often, and two, really, what are your conversations focusing on?
Yeah.
Now, for your hot leads, we wanted to make sure that our conversations focus on building more rapport with those sellers. Every single call, you're continuously building rapport. One of the most important things you can do when you call, text, or anytime you are touching a lead, right?
Yeah.
Now, there may be some active deal negotiation going on with these hot leads.
There should be, if you're doing it right.
Yes. And anything value add that you can bring to that lead, so that you're not just talking about the property and talking about business on every single call and that's it. Now, if you're doing that, really, there's probably not a lot of rapport building going into there. So anything value add that you can provide or bring to that lead that may be helpful for their situation, for the property, those are kind of the main things we try and hit every single time we're following up with hot leads.
Yeah, I'd love to give an example here. So I recently posted on my Instagram story that I've been following up with a lead since January. Now, this lead came in through calling, and he had told us $130,000. He gave me some info about condition. He gave me a timeline. He gave me motivation. They're moving out of state. So he was designated a hot lead, and then he kind of fell off the radar after we had made contact. That happens from time to time, but then all of a sudden, we made recontact with him, and we know that he still had all 4 points. So we went right back into the daily, every other day contact once he had reconnected. What ended up happening was whenever we called, we provided a little bit more info. Hey, you know what, seller name? Like, Mr. Seller, did you know that the market just increased, the interest rates in the market just increased by this amount? That actually reduces the buyer's purchasing power by approximately 10%. Mr. Seller, did you hear about the Fed? They're going to be increasing their rates. I'm happy to make you an offer today, but tomorrow's offer might be different. Hey, Mr. Seller, I'm actually going to be out in the city in like a couple days. How about I stop by and take a look at the house? We can talk. Hey, Mr. Seller, I'm going to be coming back pretty soon here for a wedding. How about I sign the contract when I'm there? Is this price agreeable with you? So each time we called, we gave a little bit more info, and eventually his timing, condition, motivation, and price all came together with us. We opened up the deal, and this guy who'd been blowing us off for like 6 months was like all excited. He like gave me a hug and a high five and was like, thanks for selling my house. Like, I'm so happy. Like, I'm glad I'm working with you. And it works out great. So it's a great example of, you have to make sure that each time you call back, you give some more info, because I think probably the reason why he ghosted us the first time was he probably didn't feel like we were giving him any value. So
yeah, hugely important. And, coming down to value add and rapport building. I mean, that's exactly it. And a big piece and a big reason of, I'm sure, why you got that deal, as opposed to maybe, any other investors he was talking to that may not have given value or provided that information, right? Now, another common sense line that we have here for our hot leads that I want to emphasize is, obviously, prioritize your hot leads over all of your other leads. Now, I want to clarify that does not mean forget about all your warm or cold leads, right? If you are focusing your time all on your hot leads, okay, great. When you have no more hot leads, now you're like a sitting duck because you weren't following up with your warm and cold leads who now might be hot leads, excuse me.
Yeah.
Right? So prioritize your hot leads, but do not neglect your warm and your cold leads is the point I'm trying to get at.
A real quick procedural comment. When you're thinking about warm, hot, and cold leads, think about it this way. A hot lead is going to be the stuff that's going to pay you soon. A warm lead is going to be what pays you in 6 months, and a cold lead is what you're going to make in a year. And your goal is to slowly move a cold lead to warm, a warm lead to hot, a hot lead to a closed deal, right? So when you're thinking about how I'm going to do my follow-up today and you are overwhelmed, focus first on the stuff that you have today, then look at the stuff you have to do over the next 6 months and over the next 12 months. The reason why you do it that way is because you could always move a cold lead follow-up a day. That's not going to change if the cold lead hears from you or not. But a hot lead might need to hear from you today to get a deal signed. So just a procedural thought process there.
Absolutely.
And like you said, don't ignore the other stuff because in 12 months, you don't want to be rebuilding out a pipeline. But focus on the hot first.
Yeah, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, is if you are focusing all your time, and we emphasize and talk about this all the time, if you're focusing all your time on, one, either current business, or two, when we're talking about leads, if you're focusing your time on all the hot leads and everything else you're neglecting and forgetting, then that's a big reason of why a lot of people see the peaks and valleys that this business is infamous for bringing, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, those were our hot leads. Let's transition into our warm leads. Now, warm leads, again, to emphasize, depending on the situation of the lead, right? Everything depends on the person, on the situation. But for our warm leads...
Well, what is a warm lead qualified as?
So warm leads qualified as something that will pay you within 6 months, right? So their time frame.
And then they typically have 2 pillars of motivation.
2 out of the 4 pillars.
So they might have a timeline and a price, but they might not have the motivation yet or the condition.
So instead of 3 or 4 out of 4 that a hot lead has, warm leads are only going to have traditionally about 2 of those pillars.
Yep.
And your follow-up can, it's kind of flexible here. It can range from weekly to bi-weekly, if not at the very max, probably about once a month, depending on your type of warm lead.
Especially if there's like a procedural thing that they're waiting on. Like if you know that they're waiting on a court date or an eviction date,
exactly.
You don't want to waste too many phone calls because that will annoy them. But that's where you're saying it's a situational thing.
That's a really important point to make too. I mean, let's use that example. You've got a lead on your team right now that matches that. Somebody who's waiting on getting more information from the court and getting all of their situation dialed in.
Yeah.
But they've already shown a couple of the pillars of motivation, right? You're not going to want to be, calling them every other day and, bombarding them and annoying them, right?
Yeah.
You just don't need to.
And we've already built amazing rapport and we've already added a lot of value. The key here for us is you made it on the date. Just don't fuck this up, right?
Yeah.
So you just have to make it through the probate process, continue to touch base, right? I don't want the seller at the end of the process to be like, well, who is the guy that originally had called me about this? I want to be like, okay, this is done. I want, after he calls his wife, for us to be the next call he makes when he gets court approval to sell the house, right?
Absolutely.
That's how you want to do it. So, it's a tasteful mix and it's going to be based off personality, and we can't teach you all that in one episode. But what we can say is, at the minimum, we're touching him at least once a month just to remind him that we're still interested. But in certain situations, it might be more like weekly or bi-weekly if he gets to a certain place and he needs help. Like, hey, did you get your probate appraisal yet? Have you gotten your right to sell yet? Have you gotten this, that, and the other yet, right?
Exactly. So conversations that you should be having with your warm leads when you're following up. Exactly. You mentioned right there, kind of checking in, value add, rapport building, similar to your hot lead conversations. But the differentiator for warm leads is going to be you're also going to want to dive deeper and focus on figuring out what those missing pillars are. Right. So they have 2 out of the 4 traditionally, but through rapport building, through value add, through your, sales skills and conversations.
Time. That's also one of probably the biggest things. Just number of times you've talked to them.
Yes. Figuring out those other 2 pillars of motivation, because that's what's going to move them from a warm to a hot lead. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, leads and people you've never talked to. I mean, think about it like this. You're not going to go spill your life story or your, story about your property to some stranger on the first call or on even the first couple calls, right? It takes time, exactly like you were mentioning. But for our warm leads, that's kind of what we're focusing on conversation-wise.
Right. And it's going to be an interesting learning curve if you've never done this before to help find those last few points or pillars. And once you have that, you have an explicit timeline, you have a condition, a price, and a motivation. You now move it up to a hot lead. That hot lead becomes a higher priority. And I want to clarify too, sometimes warm and hot can commingle a little if the timeline is far out. So if your timeline is less than a month, that's going to always be hot, or 2 months, that's pretty much always going to be hot. Once you hit 3-4 months, it might be between hot and warm, and your follow-up might be a hybrid model, right?
Exactly.
But if you know that they're going to sell in 2 to 4 months, you best believe you should set your follow-up so that you are still in front of them. Don't err on the side of caution, err on the side of aggression, because at the end of the day, the worst that happens is you call and they don't answer, or you call too much and they get a little annoyed, versus if you don't call enough, you're going to miss the opportunity where they're ready to sell and they're going to sign a contract with somebody else, and then they're going to go, I totally forgot that you wanted the house, right? So better to err on the side of aggression between hot and warm once you get all 4 pillars.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Now let's make the transition into everybody's favorite type of lead, the cold leads. So cold leads, let's start with our pillars of motivation. Cold leads usually only show 1 pillar of motivation, maybe 2.
Usually they show 1 or 2, and I would say the other part to it is that the property or the seller's situation have to match deals that you do really well with. Like either it might be like a landlord who's frustrated with their tenant but doesn't have price motivation or price, condition, or timeline. But well, that seller is frustrated today. In 12 months, he might be ready to sell.
Yeah. And we talked about this a little bit with the warm leads, but let's talk about how frequently for our cold leads, right? For cold leads, there is absolutely no reason to be following up with them every week, even every other week, right? At that point, you will be an annoyance, and that cold lead, when they do finally transition to a warm or a hot lead, they will have such a distaste in their mouth that they are not going to want to work with you. So cold leads, it's important to follow up maybe once every 2 months, once a quarter. Again, it kind of depends on the cold lead situation, but typically once every 2 months or once a quarter.
No more than once a month.
Yeah, absolutely no more than once a month. And that's unless they tell you, and all of this goes for all the leads. Kind of, we're talking about these guidelines or kind of this rough, blueprint. If a lead tells you to follow up on an exact time or an exact date, or say, hey, follow up with me, in 2 or 3 weeks, listen to the lead. If it's a cold lead, and this is common sense, but I'm going to emphasize it for everybody, a cold lead, don't call them any more than, once a month. But if they tell you, hey, call me in X date, call them sooner if they tell you to call them sooner.
Yeah. So again, like you said, it's more of a guideline. The other part to it is, like with a cold lead, we had written down volume is key. Cold leads likely aren't ready to sell today, and they're not going to be ready to sell in 3 months or 6 months. So use the fact that you got their contact information and you've had a good conversation with them to your advantage, develop a system to follow up with them enough times that you have volume over any other investor who just shows up at the door. And if you're really struggling to like close deals and you follow up with cold leads and then you get beat out, it's usually probably because you just aren't getting the number of touches in. And when you do, you're not bringing enough value, rapport building. The whole point when you're following up with a cold lead is for them to know you. It's not for you to necessarily learn a ton about the property. It's about becoming a friend of theirs, because there's no sales push. You're not ready to sell. I'm not going to push you to sell. But when the time comes, I'm interested. That's all you have to do. Exactly.
And that just comes down to, with these cold leads, building up your name recognition with the cold leads. I think there was a time you were making calls maybe last week, and then there was a time when I was making calls a couple weeks ago too, and you were like, dude, I called this guy, one of my cold leads, but hey, he knew me by my name. As soon as he answered the phone, he goes, hey, Scott. And, it's that name recognition with those cold leads that are really going to pay dividends when they move to a warm or a hot lead. So, that way, when the time, comes for them to funnel down into a warm or hot lead, the name recognition that you've built, you are front of mind with that seller.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the last thing to mention here is, like you mentioned, cold leads are like the least valued part of your time. You're going to focus on current business, then hot leads, warm leads, cold leads. Cold leads still, you can't let anything fall through the cracks. So if you have a follow-up that you missed the day before, you need to make sure that follow-up gets done. You might have skipped follow-ups because you were busy. Well, start calling through. And what I've started to do is, if I wrap up my calls for the day and I still have some time, I'll start looking forward and I'll start calling down my cold leads that I have for my future follow-up. Because if I have to call them on Friday, but I know Friday is going to be a busy day for me, on Wednesday, it's better for me to call a cold lead, because they're not going to know the difference between if I call on Wednesday or Friday. And then on Friday, I can call the hot leads that need to hear from me before the weekend starts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just a little thought process there.
Absolutely. Now, the last thing we wanted to hone in on and just talk a little bit about in our follow-up blueprint is the types of follow-up. Now, a lot of people might think we're only talking about calls, right? We mentioned with 10 days of pain, call, text, call, right? But there are various other forms of follow-up that we implement both across the board with cold leads, with warm leads, and with hot leads, right? So let's talk about them. We've got calling, we've got texting, we've got door knocking, and we've got sending a letter in the mail, right? Those are kind of the four, tools in our tool belt for follow-up.
We really don't use a lot of email. We only really email when you're in contract. And the reason why is because email is really easy to get lost in the inbox if you don't have name recognition.
Yeah. Now, obviously, calling is our main form of follow-up. It's going to be the main form of follow-up in this business, is shooting over a follow-up or a check-in call, right? It's one of the easiest ways, right next to texting and getting in that volume of calls you were talking about, right? Shooting off a quick call or shooting off a quick text, you're going to be able to get in a lot of touches compared to having to drive out and door knock somebody, or, take the time, sit down and write, a little quick handwritten letter, put it in the envelope, stick on the stamp, throw it in the mail, right? Again, a note important to make here is call at specific times of the day if requested by the lead, right?
Yeah.
And then, like we've talked about in our past two episodes, both the CRM and our past follow-up episode, is take diligent notes while you're on that phone call, right? So while you may have your AirPods in, or you're talking to them on the phone, on speaker, whatever, make sure you're sitting somewhere where you can kind of take notes in a quick outline of how that conversation goes, which just comes back to, you can always reference those calls when you call them again, and a really, really helpful tool to build rapport if you've got that log of notes and calls.
If you're concerned about calling back and you feel like you're going to be a burden or annoying, one of the best ways to make sure that you're not annoying is by actually knowing what the situation is and taking good notes when you do talk to them. one, you're respecting their time, and two, you don't have to call them back to get an idea on, hey, when did you say that you were going to be ready to go? When did you say your tenant was going to be out? Those kinds of details need to be written down so that when you call back, you're, hey, I just wanted to check in. I know that your tenant's moving out on Friday. Is that still the case? That's a totally different question than, hey, when are your tenants moving out again? And if you want to see more success, taking notes is just going to help bolster your confidence, and you're going to just come with a better mindset.
Yeah. And taking notes and keeping, diligent outlines of your calls in your CRM, that's a whole skill that, with time takes to build up, but really, really important. Whatever type of follow-up that you're doing, keeping those notes in your CRM is going to be huge for your follow-up.
Yeah.
Now, we mentioned texting. Texting, kind of the next best thing if sellers do not answer their phone, right? But texting can be, it's kind of a double-edged sword here. It is the next best thing to send when a seller doesn't answer their phone, but you've got to make sure to, in most situations, keep them concise. Don't send a big-ass paragraph to these sellers, right? Do not verbalize what your phone call would have been in the text. Right? Keep it short, keep it concise, because if you're sending out big paragraphs or, just longer text to these sellers, they're not going to want to pay attention. And again, you get into the possibility of, annoyance with all these big, long texts that are just detail focused or business focused on the property.
I fall into this sometimes. I'll text when I should have made a phone call because texting's a lot easier. It's less scary. Don't fall into that trap. Texting should bolster your phone calls, not replace them. One of the best examples I could say is when you call a seller and you get to an agreement on something, the best way to implement texting is to text what you just agreed on to make sure that it's in writing. So say you talk to a seller, you confirm an appointment over the phone. The best use of texting would then be to text, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm excited to meet at the property on Main Street at 4 p.m. on Friday. And that's like the best way. The other time that you really could use texting to your advantage is when they verbally agree to a price. Hey, Mr. Seller, I'm excited to move forward on our deal at 72.5, and leave it at that. Again, both of these are short texts. You're not verbalizing your conversation. You're bolstering and you're helping hammer in an already agreed upon acknowledgement. Or if you need clarification and it's something where that they're going to be busy that day, it's something just, hey, at your time frame, can you let me know who's going to be the signer for your trust? Whatever, right? Something little, but don't use texting as a cop-out.
Yeah, I love that. Not using it as a replacement for calling, but using it as
a supplement.
Exactly. I love that. Now, last two, we've got door knocking and letters, and these are a little bit more interesting aspects of follow-up. Let's talk about door knocking. Now, it's funny because one, it's not a good use of your time to go and be making a volume of door knocking follow-ups, the same amount of calls you might be making, right? Like with a hot lead, if you're calling them every other day, you're not going to be running down to their house to door knock them, right? So door knocking, we typically use if we're in the area, in the neighborhood, right? In that we haven't heard from the lead in a while or haven't even qualified the lead.
Right.
Now, I think we were messaging in our team Slack. You were out in Madera or Merced.
I was in Madera.
Was the lead qualified yet? Were they a cold lead? I know you had door knocked them because you were in the area for some other, another appointment or other business stuff.
So they had been documented as a hot lead. They'd given us a time frame of July, a price that we could make an offer at. The condition was clearly something that we'd be interested in. And the motivation was that one of the owners was moving out of state and the other owner couldn't afford to stay. So, they were qualified as a hot lead and then ghosted. That was back in April or May. We did 10 Days of Pain. When 10 Days of Pain was unsuccessful because she had ghosted, we then sent multiple handwritten letters, which is something we're going to talk about. And then I was in the area and I was like, you know what? This is the right time to just go knock the door. Knocked it, and I used a door hanger that we have purchased in the past, and I set that on the door. And at that point, hopefully, when I call, the number is going to match the door hanger hopefully there's some recognition, but it was just one step closer, and it's another route of trying to get a hold of somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And another, great tool to kind of keep in the back of your mind if, exactly in that situation where somebody who is a hot lead and may have ghosted, door knocking can be really effective to swing by. And even if they don't answer, exactly, leave some sort of name or brand recognition before you go.
The key here is it's really intrusive to go knock on somebody's door. So when you do it, be prepared for any kind of a response. Your entire goal is to just get in contact with them and get a deal done. So if you piss them off, you're not going to get the deal done. When I go, I like to knock on the door in a pattern, something crazy, something that doesn't sound like a police officer's banging at their door. If they don't answer, give it a minute or two, take a couple steps away from the door, just wait, go back, knock one more time. Leave it at that. If they don't answer the door, you're not going to get a hold of them. Leave your door hanger and let it go. If they open the door, say, "Hey, Mrs. Seller, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to get a hold of you. We had spoken back in April. I was looking at a different property not far away, and I just thought of you. I thought I'd come and knock on the door. Are you still hoping to sell this month, or did you change your mind?" You have to be very, very not intrusive once they open the door, because otherwise you could completely blow up your opportunity if you're too aggressive in that moment.
Yep, 100%. Kind of that make or break moment when they answer the door. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned letters, and that's kind of our last method or type of follow-up. Now, letters, handwritten notes, whatever you want to refer to them or call as, very low and very non-intrusive, right? Less intrusive than a phone call or a text, I would even say, right? And again, this can be used when you haven't gotten a hold of the lead in a while. One, just saying, "Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, just wanted to check in, blah, 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 blah," right? If you haven't been able to get a hold of them. Now, two, the other situation that these are great in is when you've just had a really great conversation with the seller, or some other reason that might prompt you to maybe not write a thank you handwritten letter, but just say, "Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, it was really great talking with you the other day. I'm looking forward to helping you in any way I can. Please feel free to reach out if there's ever anything I can do to help." So again, it can bolster a really good conversation that you may have had with the lead over the phone. Those kind of the two main situations to use them in, I would say.
I mean, we also send offers sometimes through the mail.
Yeah.
And a couple other routes. It's really great, though. Mailing is great when the phone connection stops working and or to get in a number of touches, because people aren't going to get mad at you for writing them a letter saying it was nice to talk to you and meet you. So it's one more way to get name recognition, and you never know. Usually older people read their mail more than they look at their phone. So if you're talking to somebody of an older generation, consider the fact that maybe they check their mail more often than you would, and that mail might be a great way of getting a hold of them and prompting them to give you a call. And so, yeah, I mean, the reason why we bring up the different styles is because each lead, there's a little bit of an art form in knowing when to do each thing, but the key here is understanding, delegate leads by warm, hot, and cold. Focus on hot. Don't forget about warm and cold. Your goal is to constantly move the ball forward to get each lead a little warmer, and closed. And at the end of the day, you have a couple different methods. If one way isn't working, shake it up, try something new. Don't delete leads unless you absolutely have to, because you know that they sold, they say, "Stop calling me," or something like that. There's always a chance that lead comes back. And how hard is it for you to just make a phone call, even if it goes to voicemail?
Yeah. Nope, that's it. And, I think this is going to be a great episode to go hand in hand with our episode 42. If you guys haven't listened to that we've talked about it a little bit, but really the importance of why following up is essential to being successful. Go listen to that one. I know it was just us two today. I think next week we've got 2 people coming on who we've really been bugging for a while, and we're really excited to have them on, both of them in the escrow world. So
hopefully to defog the lens that everybody has of what escrow and title is.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode of the Pursuit of Property podcast. Tune in next week when we've got our 2 guests on talking about all things escrow, and we'll see you next week.